The neighbors thought it was a raid when 135 luxury cars rolled into a dead-end street that had never seen a valet in its life. It was just after 7:10 a.m. in a quiet Vermont town, the kind where pickup trucks outnumber people, and the loudest thing most mornings is a screen door slamming shut. But today the air felt different, heavy, electric, like something didn't belong, and it didn't, because one by one, sleek black vehicles with polished chrome and tinted glass turned the corner, gliding slowly over salt-streaked pavement as if the street itself wasn't ready for them. Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Mercedes-Maybach, stretching down the block like a parade no one had planned, engines humming low, controlled, powerful, and behind every windshield, a driver in a dark suit, expression tight, eyes forward, as if they'd been given strict instructions not to speak unless spoken to. Curtains twitched inside modest homes. Coffee mugs paused midair. A man walking his dog stopped and whispered, "What in the world is going on?" But no one answered because the answer wasn't something anyone here would believe. Not yet. Because at the very end of that narrow street, where the pavement cracked and gave way to gravel, sat a small, weather-worn house with chipped white paint and a porch light that flickered even in daylight. And every single one of those cars stopped there, engines idling in quiet unison, like they had all arrived for the same reason. And then the doors opened, not all at once, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And from those cars stepped men who didn't usually step into places like this. Men who owned boardrooms, skyscrapers, companies that moved billions of dollars before breakfast. Men who were used to being seen, respected, followed. And yet now they stood shoulder to shoulder on a narrow street that didn't even have sidewalks, their expensive shoes touching melting slush, their breath visible in the cold morning air. And for a moment, none of them moved, none of them spoke, as if whatever had brought them here demanded silence first. And then one of them, tall, silver-haired, his coat perfectly tailored despite the weather, took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the front door of that small house. And if anyone had recognized him, they would have known his name instantly. William Harrington, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, who had been on the cover of every major financial magazine, who had built an empire from nothing but sharp instincts and relentless control. But right now, none of that showed, because standing there, in the cold, on a street that didn't belong to him, he looked like a man waiting for permission. And inside that house, behind a thin wooden door, Naomi Carter was still asleep, her alarm clock blinking 7:12 a.m. after losing power sometime in the night, her body wrapped in two mismatched blankets, her hands still faintly trembling from exhaustion, because less than 18 hours ago, she had been something else entirely, not the reason a convoy of luxury cars had shut down her entire street, not the woman 15 billionaires had come back for, but just a waitress finishing a late shift. At a diner, most people drove past without noticing, wiping down counters, stacking coffee mugs, listening to the wind pick up outside as the first flakes of snow tapped against the window, unaware that by the time the storm was done, it wouldn't just bury the roads, it would bury every assumption anyone had ever made about who mattered and who didn't. 18 hours earlier, the diner smelled like burnt coffee and buttered toast, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left, and Naomi Carter moved through it like she always did, quiet, efficient, invisible to the people who never bothered to look up, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the worn tile floor as she wiped down table 7, where a group of men in tailored coats had just finished a dinner that cost more than her monthly rent, their voices still echoing in the room even after they stepped outside, confident, dismissive, the kind of laughter that did not ask for permission to be loud. And Naomi did not need to hear every word to understand the tone. She had heard it her whole life, the kind that made you feel like part of the furniture, useful but forgettable. And when she reached for the check presenter, she paused for half a second, not because she expected anything different, but because she always allowed herself that 1 second of hope. And then she opened it and saw the number, $9,120, neatly signed, and beneath it, a tip that barely covered a tank of gas, $15, not even enough to pretend it was a mistake, just enough to make a point. And Naomi exhaled slowly, not angry, not surprised, just tired, because moments like that did not break you anymore. They layered on top of everything else until you learned how to carry them without letting them show. And across the counter, Evelyn Brooks, The diner owner glanced at the receipt and shook her head with a short laugh that did not hide the edge in her voice, saying that some people had more money than manners. But she did not say it loud enough for it to matter, and Naomi nodded, folding the receipt with steady hands, sliding it into her apron like it weighed nothing at all. Because dignity was something she had learned to keep regardless of what anyone else offered. And outside, the wind had started to rise, low at first, then sharper, rattling the windows like a warning no one had time to listen to. The neon sign flickered twice, casting a pale blue glow across the empty booths, and Naomi glanced toward the glass, noticing how quickly the snow was beginning to fall, not soft and gentle, but fast, heavy, swallowing the parking lot inch by inch. And for a moment, the world outside looked unfamiliar, like it had been erased and redrawn in white, and the men who had just left were already crossing the lot toward a line of cars that gleamed under the streetlight, engines starting, doors closing, their silhouettes disappearing behind tinted glass as if the storm could not touch them. And Naomi turned back to her work, stacking plates, rinsing cups, moving through the routine that kept everything in place. Because routines were safe, predictable, and in a world that often shifted without warning, that mattered. But then the power flickered once, twice, the overhead lights dimming before steadying again, and the sound of the wind grew louder, pushing against the walls like it was trying to get in. And Naomi felt something change in the room, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that made you pay attention whether you wanted to or not. And she stepped closer to the window, wiping a circle in the fog glass with the back of her hand, looking out at a road that was already disappearing beneath inches of snow, the tire tracks fading as quickly as they had been made. And for the first time that night, she wondered how far those cars would get before the storm decided otherwise. Because in a place like this, weather did not care who you were. It did not recognize money or status or the illusion of control. It just came, and when it did, it made everyone equal in the simplest way possible. And Naomi stood there for a second longer, watching the snow fall harder, faster, until the world outside the diner looked completely cut off, like a story waiting for something to happen. And she had no idea yet that before the night was over, she would be the one deciding what happened next. The storm did not arrive like a warning. It arrived like a decision. And within minutes the world beyond the diner vanished into a blur of white that erased distance, direction, and certainty all at once. The kind of snow that did not fall gently, but drove sideways, pushed by wind that howled through the valley like it had somewhere urgent to be. And Naomi Carter watched it build in layers against the glass, thick and relentless, until even the nearest streetlight faded into a dull glow, barely visible through the curtain of ice and motion. And out in that storm, the line of luxury cars that had once looked untouchable now sat scattered along the roadside like abandoned ideas, their engines struggling, headlights cutting weak tunnels through the snow before flickering uncertainly. And one by one, those engines went quiet, swallowed by the cold in a way no amount of money could argue with. And inside the diner, the heater kicked on with a tired hum, fighting against the creeping chill that slipped in through every crack and seam. And Evelyn crossed her arms, glancing toward the door with a frown that was more practical than concerned, saying that nobody in their right mind would be out there in weather like this. But Naomi did not answer because she was already moving closer to the window again, her eyes narrowing as shapes began to form in the storm, shadows at first, then figures, blurred outlines struggling against the wind. And for a second, it did not make sense, because people like that did not walk. They were driven, carried, protected by layers of convenience that kept the world at a comfortable distance. And yet here they were, stepping away from their cars, coats pulled tight, shoulders hunched against a force they could not negotiate with. And Naomi felt something shift inside her. Not surprise, not satisfaction, but recognition, because for the first time that night, they looked like everyone else, cold, uncertain, human in a way that had nothing to do with status. And one of them, taller than the rest, paused just outside the diner door, his hand hovering near the handle, as if even this simple act required permission. And Naomi knew him instantly. William Harrington, the man whose presence had filled the room earlier without ever once acknowledging hers. And now he stood there with snow collecting on his shoulders, his breath visible in sharp bursts, his confidence stripped down to something quieter, something more careful. and behind him, the others shifted, some glancing back toward the road, as if expecting it to fix itself. Others rubbing their hands together, the cold working its way through. Expensive fabric that had never been designed for this kind of night. And inside, Evelyn stepped forward quickly, shaking her head before the door could even open, her voice low but firm as she said that they could not take in a group like that, not with the power already flickering and supplies limited, that this was not a shelter, it was a business, and Naomi understood the logic, she really did. Because survival often came down to choices that were not fair but necessary, but she also saw something else, something that had nothing to do with logic, the way one man in the group leaned slightly against the car behind him, his balance unsteady, the way another kept flexing his fingers as if trying to bring feeling back into them, the way William did not knock, did not demand, just stood there waiting. And Naomi took a breath that felt heavier than it should have, the kind of breath that carried more than air, and she stepped past Evelyn without raising her voice, without making it dramatic, just reaching for the handle and pulling the door open, letting the wind rush in for a second before stepping aside. Her words simple, steady, and impossible to misunderstand as she said, "You should come inside." And for a moment, no one moved, not because they did not hear her, but because something in the moment required them to understand what was being offered, not just warmth, not just shelter, but something they had not given her earlier, something they had not even noticed they were withholding. And then William nodded once, quiet and deliberate, and stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a space that had never been built for men like him, followed by the others, their presence filling the diner in a way that felt almost surreal, as if two completely different worlds had collided under one flickering neon sign. And Naomi closed the door behind them, the storm still raging outside, unaware that inside, something far more important had just begun. Warmth did not return all at once. It came in layers, slow and uneven, like the room itself was trying to decide whether it could handle the sudden shift in energy. 15 men stepping in from a world of glass towers and private jets into a diner where the floor creaked and the coffee machine hissed louder than any conversation. And for a moment, no one knew where to stand, where to look, or what to say, because power, when stripped of its environment, has a way of losing its voice. And Naomi Carter did not rush to fill that silence. She moved with purpose instead, grabbing a stack of old wool blankets from a storage shelf near the back, the kind that had been there for years in case of emergencies no one ever expected to happen. And she handed them out one by one, not asking names, not checking status, just meeting eyes briefly and passing warmth from her hands to theirs. And the men accepted them with a quietness that would have surprised anyone who had seen them just hours earlier. Their fingers stiff, their movements slower now, the cold still clinging to them in ways that money could not shake off. And Evelyn hovered near the counter, watching the scene unfold with a tight expression, calculating, uncertain, her instincts pulling in one direction while the reality of the moment pulled in another. And she muttered something about limited supplies, about how long the power might last. But Naomi had already turned toward the stove, lighting the burners with steady hands, the small blue flames flickering to life as if they understood the urgency better than anyone else in the room. And soon the scent of something simple but necessary began to fill the air, broth warming in a dented pot, bread placed carefully on a griddle, not fancy, not impressive, but enough to remind the body that it was still being taken care of. And as the minutes passed, the room began to settle into a new rhythm, the wind still howling outside, rattling the windows with force, but inside, there was a different kind of sound now, quieter, more human, the rustle of blankets, the soft clink of ceramic mugs, the low murmur of voices that were no longer trying to impress anyone. And William Harrington stood near the edge of it all, his posture still straight out of habit, but his eyes moving differently now, taking in details he would have ignored before, the worn edges of the counter, the way Naomi moved without hesitation, the way she seemed to understand what each person needed before they asked. And when she placed a mug in his hands, her fingers brushed his for just a second, not enough to linger, not enough to mean anything more than what it was, and yet it was enough to make him pause, because in that moment, there was no hierarchy, no distance, just one human being handing another something warm in the middle of a storm. And he looked at her as if trying to place her, not her face. Exactly, But the feeling of being seen without expectation, and Naomi did not hold his gaze longer than necessary. She simply nodded once and moved on, because there were others to check on, others whose shoulders still trembled slightly under the blankets, and one man, older, seated near the far booth, leaned forward with his hands clasped together, his breathing shallow, his eyes unfocused in a way that did not match the room, and Naomi noticed immediately, because she had spent years reading people in small ways that mattered more than words, and she crossed the room quickly, kneeling slightly to meet him at eye level, her voice calm, steady, asking simple questions that did not overwhelm, guiding him back into the moment one breath at a time. And around them, the others watched, not interrupting, not offering solutions, just witnessing something they did not control. And for the first time that night, the diner was not just a place to wait out the storm. It was something else entirely, a space where roles had quietly shifted, where the person who had been invisible hours earlier now held the center without asking for it. And outside, the snow continued to fall, relentless, covering the road, the cars, the tracks that had once led here, erasing every sign of how they had arrived, as if the world itself was making sure that what mattered now was not where they came from, but what they did next. Time did not move the same way inside the diner anymore. It stretched, slowed, bent around small actions that suddenly carried more weight than they should have. And Naomi Carter felt it in every step she took, every decision she made without hesitation. Because this was no longer just about letting people in from the cold. It was about keeping them safe through something that was not done yet. And outside, the storm pressed harder against the building, wind slamming into the walls with a force that made the windows tremble in their frames, snow piling higher against the glass until the lower half of the world disappeared completely, and the power flickered again, longer this time, the lights dimming low enough to make everyone look up at once, the brief silence filled only by the hum of the heater fighting to stay alive, and Evelyn let out a quiet breath, more worried now. Her earlier resistance replaced by something closer to concern, because if the power went out completely, the diner would lose more than comfort. It would lose time, and time was something none of them could afford to waste, especially not the older man Naomi had been watching, who now sat with his back against the booth, his color returning slowly but not fully, his hands still wrapped tightly around the mug she had given him as if it anchored him to something real. And Naomi moved toward the storage closet again, pulling out a small battery-powered radio, the plastic casing scratched from years of disuse. And she turned the dial carefully until a faint signal broke through the static, a voice barely audible, but enough to confirm what she already suspected: roads closed, visibility near zero, emergency services delayed, instructions to stay where you are and conserve heat. And she set the radio on the counter where everyone could hear it, not to alarm them, but to ground them in reality. Because uncertainty without information was worse than the truth. And William Harrington listened closely, his expression tightening not with panic, but with calculation, the kind of mind that had built empires now faced with a problem that could not be solved with strategy alone. And for a moment, he stepped closer to Naomi, his voice lower than before, more measured, asking what she needed, not as a command, but as a question. And it was a subtle shift, but one that did not go unnoticed, because people like him were not used to asking. And Naomi met his gaze briefly before, answering in the same calm tone she had used all night, saying that they needed to keep everyone warm, keep everyone hydrated, and keep everyone awake enough to respond if something changed. Simple things, basic things, but things that required attention. And William nodded once, not offering solutions, just accepting direction in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. And across the room, one of the younger men stood up, pulling his coat tighter around himself, pacing a few steps before stopping, the energy in his movements restless, and used to waiting, and used to being still. And Naomi recognized that too, because fear did not always look like weakness. Sometimes it looked like impatience, like the need to do something when there was nothing to do. And she handed him a stack of folded towels, asking him to place them along the bottom of the door to block the draft, giving him purpose without calling it that. And he took them without protest, kneeling to press them into place, his hands moving quickly, grateful for something to focus on. And slowly, the room adjusted again, people finding small roles, small ways to contribute. even if it was just holding a flashlight steady or passing out. Cups of water, and in that quiet redistribution of responsibility, something else shifted, something deeper than the storm outside, because the lines that had once separated them were fading, replaced by something simpler, something more honest, the understanding that survival did not care about titles, that warmth was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and that the person who provided it mattered more than the person who could afford it. And Naomi did not say any of that out loud. She did not need to, because the room was already beginning to understand, one action at a time, one moment at a time, as the storm continued to rage beyond the walls, relentless, indifferent, but no longer in control of what was happening inside. The night deepened in a way that made time feel heavier, each minute stretching longer than the last, and the storm outside showed no sign of slowing. The wind now hitting the diner in steady waves that sounded almost like the ocean crashing against a distant shore, except colder, sharper, more relentless, and inside. The air had grown warmer, but not comfortable, because warmth in a situation like this was something you protected, not something you relaxed into, and Naomi Carter understood that instinctively, moving from one end of the diner to the other with the same steady rhythm, checking on each person without making it obvious, adjusting a blanket here, refilling a cup there, keeping the balance without drawing attention to herself, and the men, who just hours ago had been surrounded by assistants and schedules and controlled environments, now followed her lead without question, their movements quieter, more deliberate, as if they were learning a language they had never needed before. And William Harrington stood near the counter again, his coat now draped over the back of a chair, his sleeves rolled slightly, revealing that he was no longer trying to maintain the distance he had carried earlier, and he watched Naomi not with curiosity anymore, but with something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when you realize someone else has been holding a kind of strength you never had to develop, and for the first time, he spoke not to direct, not to negotiate, but to understand, asking her how she knew what to do, how she stayed so calm when everything outside was falling apart. And Naomi paused just long enough to consider the question, not because she did not have an answer, but because she had never needed to explain it before, and when she did speak, her voice remained simple, grounded, saying that when you grow up with less, you learn early what matters and what does not, that you learn how to read a room, how to see what people need before they ask, because sometimes asking comes too late, and William listened in a way he had not listened to anyone in a long time, not interrupting, not reframing, just absorbing the words as they were. And across the diner, the older man Naomi had been watching shifted slightly, his breathing steadier now, his eyes clearer, and when he caught her looking, he gave a small nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but enough to say that he was still here, and Naomi returned the nod, just as quietly, because survival did not always require words. And near the entrance, the younger man who had been restless earlier now sat with his back against the wall, his hands wrapped around a cup he had refilled himself this time, no longer waiting to be served, no longer expecting things to appear without effort. And it was in these small changes that the real shift happened, not in grand gestures, not in declarations, but in the way people adjusted when the world removed everything they thought they controlled. And then the lights flickered again, harder this time, the room dimming to near darkness for a full second before the emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a softer, more fragile glow. And Evelyn let out a quiet sound under her breath, the reality of their situation settling in fully now. Because if the main power failed completely, they would be relying on whatever they had left, and Naomi moved quickly, checking the back hallway, confirming that the generator they rarely used had engaged, its low rumble barely noticeable, but steady, a lifeline in a night that had taken everything else away. And when she returned, she did not announce it. She simply resumed her place in the rhythm, because reassurance did not always need to be spoken. Sometimes it was felt in the absence of panic, and William noticed that too. The way she carried certainty without showing strain, the way she made decisions without asking for approval. And something in him shifted again, deeper this time, not just respect, but awareness. The kind that does not come easily, because it requires you to see your own blind spots clearly. And he glanced around the diner, at the men he had built deals with, competed with, trusted and challenged over the years, and he saw them differently now, not as competitors or allies, but as people who, just like him, had stepped into a situation where none of their usual advantages applied. And at the center of it all was Naomi Carter, a woman who had been invisible to them hours ago, now holding the entire night together without ever asking for recognition. And outside, the storm continued to press against the world, but inside, something steadier had taken root, something that would not disappear when the snow melted, something that none of them would be able to ignore once morning came. Sometime past midnight, when the storm had settled into a steady, relentless rhythm, the diner grew quieter, not because the danger had passed, but because exhaustion had begun to take its place, the kind that settles deep in the body after hours of tension. And one by one, the men shifted into stillness, some leaning back against booths, others sitting with their heads bowed, conserving energy without needing to be told. And Naomi Carter noticed it immediately, the way awareness softened at the edges when people grew tired, the way small signs could be missed if no one stayed alert. And she moved with more intention now, checking each face, each posture, making sure no one slipped too far into silence. And near the far booth, the older man she had been watching earlier stirred again, his breathing uneven for just a moment before settling. And Naomi stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on the table near him, not touching, just present, anchoring him back into the room. Her voice low as she asked him to stay with her, to keep. His eyes opened for a minute longer, and he nodded faintly, focusing on her voice the way someone focuses on a light in the distance. And across the room, William Harrington watched that exchange carefully, not as an observer anymore, but as someone trying to understand what made it work, what allowed Naomi to hold the room together when everything outside was still falling apart. And for the first time, he saw something he had missed before, not just her calm, not just her awareness, but the way she carried responsibility without making it feel like control, the way she gave people something to hold on to without taking anything from them. And it stayed with him longer than he expected, that realization settling in quietly but firmly. And then, almost without warning, a sound cut through the room, sharp and unfamiliar, the radio on the counter crackling louder than before, the static breaking just enough for a voice to come through more clearly, dispatch reporting multiple stranded vehicles along Route 14, advising that rescue teams were still hours out, conditions worsening in low areas. And Naomi moved toward it quickly, adjusting the dial to keep the signal steady, listening not just to the words, but to what they meant, calculating time, distance, risk. And behind her, the men shifted again, more alert now, drawn back from their exhaustion by the reminder that the storm had not finished testing them yet. And one of them spoke, his voice uncertain but steady enough to carry, asking how much longer they might be stuck. And Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she chose her words carefully, understanding that truth mattered, but so did how it was given. And when she did speak, she kept it simple, saying that morning would bring clearer conditions, that the roads would not stay closed forever, that what mattered right now was getting through the night safely. And there was something in the way she said it that settled the room again. Not false hope, not reassurance without reason, just a steady belief in what could be done. And William stepped forward slightly, glancing at the others before speaking, his voice carrying more weight now, not from authority, but from alignment, agreeing with her, reinforcing what she had said in his own way. And it was subtle, but it mattered, because the room was no longer divided between those who led and those who followed. It was moving together, one decision at a time, and Naomi noticed that too, the way William had shifted from standing apart to standing with. And she gave a small nod, acknowledging it without making it larger than it needed to be. And outside, the storm finally began to change, not ending, not yet, but easing just enough for the wind to lose its sharpest edge, the snow falling a little slower, a little less aggressive. And through the window, faint and distant, the outline of the road began to return, barely visible, but there, a sign that the night was not endless. And inside, no one celebrated, no one spoke about it directly, but the shift was felt, a quiet understanding passing through the room that they had made it through the hardest part. Not because of luck, not because of what they had before, but because someone had chosen to act when it mattered most, and that choice had changed everything. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, almost cautiously, like the world itself was unsure if it was safe to begin again. And the first sign was not light but silence, the kind that follows after something powerful has finally let go. And inside the diner, Naomi Carter noticed it before anyone else. The way the wind no longer pressed against the walls with the same force, the way the windows no longer trembled, and she turned slightly toward the glass, wiping away a thin layer of frost with her sleeve, revealing a softened landscape beyond. The snow still deep, still covering everything in sight, but no longer moving with urgency, just resting where it had fallen. And for the first time in hours, the world looked still, and behind her, the others began to sense it too, not through sound, but through the absence of it, the shift from survival to something quieter, something steadier, and one by one, they stood, stretching stiff muscles, adjusting coats, glancing toward the door not with fear now, but with cautious expectation, and William Harrington stepped closer to the window, his eyes scanning the road that had once disappeared completely, now faintly visible beneath layers of white, tire tracks from the night before almost erased, but still traceable if you looked closely. And he exhaled slowly, not in relief exactly, but in recognition, because what they had just come through was not something he could measure or calculate. It was something he had lived through, something that had stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what mattered. And he turned back toward the room, toward Naomi, who was already moving again, not slowing down just because the storm had eased, because she understood that the transition from crisis to safety was not immediate. It required care, attention, making sure no one rushed too quickly into a sense of security that had not fully arrived. And she checked the older man once more, her hand hovering near his shoulder as she spoke to him in a low, steady voice, confirming that he felt stronger, that he could stand when he was ready. And he nodded, more certain this time, his movements slow but controlled as he rose, supported lightly by the edge of the booth. And around them, the others began to gather their things, not in the hurried way of people eager to leave, but in the thoughtful way of people who understood that something important had happened here, something that would not stay confined to this room. And then, faint at first, almost blending into the quiet, a distant sound reached them, low and mechanical, growing slowly as it moved closer, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, listening, recognizing it before anyone else did, the sound of engines, not struggling this time, but steady, purposeful, and William heard it too, his posture shifting as he moved toward the door, his hand resting on the handle for a moment before opening it carefully, the cold air rushing in again, sharp but no longer hostile. And outside, through the thinning snowfall, shapes began to appear in the distance, vehicles moving along the cleared portion of the road, headlights cutting through the morning haze. And as they drew closer, the outline became clearer, emergency trucks, utility vehicles, people stepping out in heavy gear, moving with practiced efficiency. And for a moment, no one inside the diner spoke. They simply watched, because the arrival of help did not feel like a victory. It felt like a transition, the end of one chapter and the beginning of something they had not yet fully understood. And Naomi stood just behind William, her arms folded lightly, her expression calm, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present, as she had been all night. And when the first responders reached the diner, knocking firmly but respectfully before stepping inside, the room shifted once more, not back to what it had been before, but into something new, something shaped by the hours they had just shared. And as questions began, as names were exchanged, as plans were made for clearing the road and getting everyone home safely, one truth settled quietly beneath it all, unspoken but undeniable, that none of them would walk away from this morning as the same people who had entered that diner the night before. By the time the last emergency vehicle pulled away and the road was declared passable, the diner no longer felt like the same place it had been the night before, not because anything physical had changed, the same worn booths, the same chipped counter, the same flickering neon sign still humming faintly above the door, but because the people inside had shifted in ways that could not be undone. And Naomi Carter felt it in the quiet that followed, the kind of quiet that was not empty but full, carrying everything that had happened without needing to repeat it. And one by one, the men who had taken shelter there began to step outside, guided by responders, directed toward waiting transport, their movements steady now, their voices lower, more measured, as if something in them had been recalibrated overnight. And William Harrington was the last to leave, not because he needed more time, but because he chose to take it, his hand resting briefly on the back of a chair as he looked around the room one final time, taking in details that would have meant nothing to him before. And when he turned toward Naomi, there was no hesitation in his expression, no distance left to maintain, just a clarity that had not been there before. And for a moment, he did not speak, not because he did not have words, but because he understood that some things were better said without rushing them. And when he finally did, his voice was steady, quieter than it had been the night before, carrying none of the authority it once relied on, only sincerity. And he thanked her, not in a way that sounded practiced, not like something prepared for an audience, but in a way that felt personal, specific, grounded in everything she had done without ever asking for recognition. And Naomi nodded once, not dismissing it, but not holding on to it either, because for her, what had happened was not about gratitude. It was about doing what needed to be done when it mattered. And William seemed to understand that, because he did not try to extend the moment. He simply acknowledged it and stepped outside, joining the others as the morning carried them away from a place that had quietly redefined everything they thought they understood. And for a while, life moved forward in its usual rhythm, the storm becoming a story people mentioned in passing, the roads cleared, the diner reopening fully, customers returning, conversations resuming, as if the night had been just another event in a long winter. But then came the morning that no one in that small Vermont town would forget, the morning when the sound of engines filled the air again, not distant this time, not uncertain, but deliberate, organized. And when people stepped outside, what they saw did not make sense at first, a line of vehicles unlike anything the town had ever seen, stretching far beyond the end of the street, polished surfaces reflecting the early light, drivers stepping out in coordinated precision, and doors opening one after another, revealing the same men who had stood in that diner just hours before. But now they stood differently, not elevated, not separate, but aligned in purpose. And they did not arrive with noise or spectacle, they arrived with intention, moving toward Naomi's small home at the end of the street, stopping there as if that was the only place that mattered. And when Naomi opened her door, still holding a cup of coffee, not yet fully aware of what she was stepping into, she saw them standing there, not as figures of power, not as men who controlled markets and industries, but as individuals who had come back to complete something that had begun the night before. And William stepped forward again, not leading, but representing something larger than himself. And he spoke simply, explaining that what she had done could not be measured in dollars or repaid in any single gesture, but that they would not walk away from it unchanged. And what followed was not one grand offer, not one dramatic moment, but many, each man contributing in his own way, opportunities, support, commitments that extended far beyond that street, far beyond that morning. And Naomi stood there, listening, not overwhelmed, not hesitant, but grounded in the same quiet strength that had carried her through the storm, because she understood something. They were only beginning to learn that real power is not in what you can take or control, but in what you choose to give when no one is watching. And as the street filled with presence it had never known, one truth settled deeper than the spectacle itself, that the night had not changed who Naomi Carter was. It had revealed it, and in doing so, it had changed everyone